We are live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Vagabond Dog Industry Chats. This week we have Albert Shih, which you created Superliminal, which has recently had a multiplayer update, which takes, for those of you who have not played it, Superliminal is one of my favorite games of the last couple of years. It is a first-person puzzle game that deals a lot with perspective-based puzzles. The concept of something closer to the camera is larger in perspective, and in the reality of Superliminal, it also happens to actually make it larger. And this multiplayer update you guys have recently shipped takes that, brings it into a competitive 12-person sort of race through a gauntlet of rooms that feature all of the mechanics from the single player game in a really wonderful way. So welcome to the show, and please, if you've got anything to add about how the game works, it is a bit of a mind bender, so if you perhaps you can explain it a little better than I can.
I mean, I think you explained it pretty well. Plus, with the whole finger thing that people always, you know, do. Yeah. So the game kind of works based on the ambiguity of depth, right? So on your screen, you see things as flat instead of in perspective. So that lets you do things like you're looking at a thing. It could be a bunch of different sizes and at a bunch of different depths, and it kind of plays with that by letting you kind of adjust that in a way, right? Plus, it has some other perspective D stuff. But yeah.
Right. So this is a game that, I'm sure you feel free to correct me, but it feels like a mechanic first game, right? So you
Yeah.
you develop this mechanic, and then it's about building puzzles and structure around that. So I want you to rewind us all the way back to the inception of the mechanic, and that goes on to feed everything else. But can you tell us about where you first sort of started developing this base idea?
Yeah, so this was maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. It's been a while, right? There's actually it was one of my classes in college where it was actually an AI programming class. It was called game programming, but it was actually AI game programming.
Mm-hmm.
But I still just wanted to make games. So for the final, project, I wanted to make a game and then add some, flocking AI algorithms at the very end. Uh, but the thing was that I didn't have any art skills, right? I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't make my own art. So I thought, hey, I'll just do something as simple as possible, which is I'll just make something that requires no art but still is kind of interesting, which led me to, first person puzzle games, you know. And from there, I was kind of just like, I want to move an object in a way because, other games, Portal, whatever, they're all more or less about moving objects. And just in my spare time, I kind of thought about all the different ways I could do that, and they all kind of sucked because they were too complicated. Imagine if like you could grab things in front of you and then twist them in different dimensions. Over time, it's just like it's more and more complicated. And then so I was just thinking, well, what if I just grabbed an object and I just dropped it down, and it was just like that,
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't really make sense in my mind at first until I thought about it a little bit more and I was like, wait, I don't know if anyone has done this thing. Maybe I should, take a stab at it. So the first inception of it was actually just it had, really like three puzzles, if even then. And it was all built, in Unity with no lighting, and it was built in like a week.
Right. But that's the process of getting a mechanic locked down. A lot of people start making games and they get really bogged down with aesthetic and function and levels and everything before really nailing the core mechanic. So in that inception phase, when you
Yep.
are in your unlit Unity workroom,
Right.
how long did it take for you before you really felt satisfied with that mechanic?
Oh, I see. Yeah, that it's really interesting because um it was very step by step, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like the first time actually, then that first week I made the thing, there were a lot of issues with it because just the way I programmed it, it was very clunky. You would get block back then I had a thing where you couldn't pick up an item if it was blocked by something else, just to keep the perspective, right? And there's just a bunch of issues like that it felt like the whole thing was very clunky. It would be easily broken, and it just wasn't that fun to play with. So it wasn't that point where I was like, oh, this is an amazing thing, I'll make it. I kind of just put it down for, maybe another half a year. And then the game kind of just like slowly, step by step, uh, reached points where I was just a little bit more certain that it was a good idea, until it actually shipped. So it wasn't like there wasn't like one point. It was more of a process.
Right. So it's interesting. Usually, when I talk to devs who have a strong mechanic, there's like a
Mm,
eureka moment
right.
when they're like, "Oh, this thing works, and now I want to build a game around it." But am I getting the story right that you sort of just had this, idea, and then just slowly kept working on it and working on it because you had faith in it from the start, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I think there was that eureka moment, and that was strong enough to kind of move me ahead at certain points. But with any eureka moment, usually there's like a low point where you actually start
Right.
working and you're like, this actually kind of sucks. And then at that point, you might do something else, but then I eventually came back.
Right. Yeah. No, you said this was a 7 or 8 year journey making this game,
Yeah.
and we talked a little bit pre-show. This is your first shipped game.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
That's a very surprise. That's a very very high bar to have started out on. Um, how did you feel? Like, how did you feel about that process being your first game? Most devs, start off with a lot of jam games or making smaller projects before jumping into something
Oh,
as big as
yeah.
Superliminal.
Well, yes. I mean, I have done jam games and
Hmm.
smaller games, but nothing on like this scale, right? Nothing commercial that
Right.
was paid for. But I've definitely done a couple of jam games here and there. But this was a completely different scale, right? Because when you're talking about even like, a half year long project versus like a multiple year long project, is just the planning process and kind of mentally what you're expecting is very different. So I think there's just a lot of expectations, right? Like I expected that we would finish really in like 2 years at the beginning,
Mhm.
and it ended up being more like seven. So just the whole planning process was interesting.
So what made it take so long? Not to say. I mean,
Yeah.
games take what they take, right? But I
Right,
mean,
right,
what
right.
what what made it such a lengthy experience?
Yeah, I think there are probably two parts to that. One is, um and these are both things that could have been improved on, right? One was uh kind of just the development of the idea, figuring out what works with it, what doesn't work, right? We went with kind of like a kind of surreal but mundane location, so things kind of seemed more interesting, and we had different mechanics and stuff. So that was part of the time, just the actual development time of the game, since we had uh it, I don't know if this is true, but I feel like there were so many things that we had to figure out with this game because the mechanics were weird enough that we couldn't just take something off the shelf. So that was part of it, right?
Hmm.
The other part of it was maybe just, um, when you talk about, as a single dev with like no resources, all the way to, shipping a game with, seven people on their team. How does that happen? And that's also a process as well, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
you need to start alone. You probably need to build something that attracts attention. Then you build something else that other people are interested in. Maybe you get, the game pitched to publisher and all that. So that process itself also, takes a while.
Right. I mean, and that I think is very common, especially when you're working in territory nobody's really walked before. It's really easy to make a Metroidvania or a traditional first-person shooter in a year and a half, 2 years. But if you're
Right.
making something that nobody's ever done before, I think it's absolutely understandable that it's going to take a long time. Um, what fascinates me is the length of time to make the core game, and then how quickly you guys made the multiplayer update.
Oh,
Is this just a matter of having the entire process and team refined to a point where you guys are able to work really well, or how did that come together so quickly?
Yeah, I think what was surprising by that what was surprising um, was that first of all, it took maybe 3 4 months, and it's multiplayer, right? And usually
Mm-hmm.
you we say, hey, you want to take twice as long. I think just yeah, our familiarity with the tools and what we could do and could not do, just let us put that together really quickly. Um, for example, we didn't have to refigure out our pipeline, because when we were doing it for the first time, there are a lot of issues, a lot of bugs, and then things would get light mapped and then break, or objects would disappear and stuff like that. All that we kind of knew how to deal with, so that was really quick. All the mechanics were more or less there. We, came up with a couple new ones. Um, I think it's also there's less pressure in a way because we know that it's a multiplayer product that people can come back to and try. It's not just a single
Mm-hmm.
player campaign that they will play once and just have kind of a permanent impression of the game. So in a way, I feel like we put a little less pressure on ourselves that it has to be like each pixel has to be perfect.
Right, right, right. So I'm very curious for the process that went into designing the concept and then the level or the pieces to the multiplayer stage because what was the process like for retrofitting this single player
I see.
campaign
Yeah.
to a multiplayer experience?
Yeah, our process was a little bit weird because it was so chaotic during those couple months
Mm-hmm.
that we were trying to get things together. At the beginning, we actually just had our single player campaign that you could play through multiplayer, but race each other through. And then at some point, we're like, well, this is fun up to an extent. We can't improve this anymore. So we just, made completely new levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so our process was kind of like step one was how do we take something from the single player game and then make it into, a multiplayer level? And maybe step two is try to have it work with a couple of different, general guidelines that we came up with, which is like, you want to have some interaction with other people, but not too much because that just leads to, a lot of griefing.
Right.
You wanted kind of almost like a funneling situation where you have people spread out and then they eventually at some point come together. You don't want it to be too punishing. So, if you're at the end of the level, somebody tosses you way to the beginning, that can feel a little bit bad. So, or if you're really high up and you drop all the way down, right? So the punishment is kind of not too severe. Um, and and I think also another one was like, uh, it wasn't difficult enough that super high skilled players would 100% of the time just ace the thing while other people's were just at the beginning, right? Because then you don't want players what in this type of game to just get completely destroyed by someone else who's played it more times.
It
So
it's really fascinating to hear you talk about it because you're talking almost exclusively about what I would consider game design elements.
right.
Where I would assume, and I think a lot of people would assume, the hardest part of retrofitting a game would be the technical side, making sure that like
Mm,
the connectivity works and there's especially when you have such a funky mechanic like the perspective. Um, so did that just come together really quickly and give you so much time to focus on design, or how was it on the technical side?
yeah, the technical side, I'm definitely less familiar with because mostly Phil, who's like our sole programmer, you know, did basically all that stuff. But it came together roughly in about a month, and then we had a couple fixes for physics issues later on. But yeah, that part surprisingly wasn't that difficult or that time consuming. There were some networking issues that was just annoying to deal with,
Mm-hmm.
making sure rooms and stuff and loading stuff worked. But the actual physics of it was kind of just like if an if a player grabbed an object, move that object for everyone, essentially, right? There's some, you know, things about passing the ownership of the object around just because of how photon works. Um, but overall, it was weirdly enough, it wasn't that difficult. Did have to do a couple weird things just so things wouldn't look too weird. And what I mean by like that is in a single player game, when a player grabs something, it kind of turns into 2D in a way, right? But
Hmm.
in game, what we're doing is we're moving the object as far as possible and as large as possible, and it's just kind of gliding around towards the walls. But you don't want to do that, in the multiplayer because you'll just knock things over, right?
Right.
So the way we visualized it was kind of that turns to a projection, then then is projected out into the world, and other players can see that projection and see what's going on as uh, you move it, and then it pops back to reality when you drop the object.
It's funny. So that's one of the things that I noticed, particularly when I was playing the multiplayer, is that sort it's like almost like a decal on the wall that moves around when
Yeah.
the player,
Hmm.
and it sort of helped me. I mean, it's a hard mechanic to wrap your head around, even if you've played through the game. But seeing it that way really helped put it into perspective, and it improved my ability as a single player,
Mm,
which is
right.
something I didn't really expect. Um, are there? I can't remember, but are there any mechanics in the single player that you think just like won't work in the multiplayer at all?
Um, Let me think. I don't think so. I believe. Well, no. Yeah, I think most of them do work. There's some that look a little bit weird. So when you have, you know, a projection of an object and you stand in the right place and it pops out of existence, stuff like that, that to a different player might seem a little bit weird, but I think in general they all work in some extent, right? It's just how much weirdness players are going to deal with.
Right. And then, so I mean, you talked a little bit about the difference between designing levels in the single player and designing levels for the multiplayer. Is there sort of a process that you've come to adapting the experiences, or is it entirely like you start from the ground up on a multiplayer portion? We'll call them a room, a multiplayer room.
Yeah.
Do you start from the ground up and just like build it as its own multiplayer thing, or are you going more adaptive, looking at like rooms from the single player and converting the concepts to multiplayer?
Yeah, we definitely did the second one. I think on one hand it was easier because it's more of you have a core concept already and you're just adapting it to more players. I think on the other hand was that we knew that our single player stuff always showed off certain things that if we applied it over, it would still be interesting, right? Because the worst case is I don't know if you end up making some stuff that ends up not really really needing you to use perspective in some way, that would not be cool. We still do have some of those weird multiplayer levels that that have to do with fire extinguishers, boosting you around, that are just kind of fun and traversal based. Um, but those to us are kind of like pattern breakers, right? Because
Right.
whenever you have a lot of one thing, it's always nice to have a couple of highlights that are just something different that kind of change your expectation a little bit.
It it also feels like so there's a level of accessibility required in making a multiplayer room versus the single player, because especially because there's a time pressure,
Right.
and that anxiety of competition kind of rises when you're in the multiplayer room. Um, is there a secret to making accessible mind bender games? Because I love games like these that tickle your
Yeah.
brain in a weird way. A lot of non-Euclidean experiences, though, kind of tend to be really painful if your brain doesn't
Right.
like
Right.
get there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so what is the secret to like messing with a player's mind but not like making it a struggle?
Yeah. I think our game doesn't necessarily nail this completely, but to me, the way to do it is essentially, you have a problem that players once the first time they enter the room, they can't figure out, right?
Hmm.
They try all the things um, that they've done before and it doesn't work. But eventually, even if they don't really figure out, if they try enough things, they'll come to the conclusion. Uh, Ideally, right? It's that where you kind of give them the aha moment, right? You want them to get stuck for some short amount of time, and after a while, even if they're completely stuck, there's only so many options in the room that they'll eventually figure it out.
Right.
And yeah, and that's where I think in our game it's a little bit weird because sometimes we have so many items in the room or just objects lying around that it might be harder to figure out. But I can see in a more like minimalistic game, there's only like, three items. And so eventually you'll kind of make that connection just by playing around with things.
I think the best example of this in the multiplayer is that room, or it's more like a hallway with there's the one glass panel, and then there's
Oh,
all the
yeah.
doors, and you end up looping through if you're going through the wrong doors. And I remember my experience with it was, first I'm just going to try and get over the glass. So you run up and you jump and you jump and
Mm.
you jump, and then you try and jump off somebody's head, and maybe that works. Or if you've brought an item from another room, it works. And then you just start spamming through all of the rooms, the doors, completely haphazardly, until eventually, and this is, I guess, a little pro gamer tips going here right now, but if you look through the glass, you can see visual cues. And then if you
Right.
look through the doors, there's visual cues in each of the doors to tell you if this is the right room or the wrong room. And it made me realize the genius of the level design there. There's always a proper clue. There's ways to solve it if you're not able to figure it out, but there's always the possibility of a clue without being totally handheld. Do you, so I'm curious about your process or your thought process on guiding a player, because it's not quite handheld, but it's not obtuse. Like, how do you strike a balance between assuming how much intelligence the player is going to apply to the situation, and how much they're going to try and figure things out the right way versus just brute forcing it?
Yeah, a different way that we kind of look at it was it has to work with like the worst or the least capable player, and it also has to work with the most experienced player, right? So, uh, ideally, and we didn't do this with all the levels, but ideally there would be some shortcut that would give the experienced player a little bit of an edge. But if you brute force it and you don't know what the puzzle is about, you can still figure it out, right? And so this, another example would be we have this pool room where you're supposed to climb up and go to the top, and there's these, you could take the main path, which is, very easy, or you could go across these girders that are very thin, but you have a chance of falling out off, right? And so for the experienced players, taking that risk would be worth it. And so, we just want to make sure that there's, some room for mastery, even though anybody should be able to get through these puzzles.
The thing that I'm curious in, because there's so much attention to the design of each room, how scalable do you think the multiplayer experience is beyond this point? Is it reasonable to expect? Could you easily make more rooms? Is it, how hard is the design process on each one?
Um,
No
I guess
commitments.
no commitments. Yeah, I guess making more new rooms that does take time. We are planning to do a couple more. Another part of it that could be interesting is just adding more elements of randomization, right?
Hmm.
Like you have a level, but maybe you change a couple elements, so each time you go through, it feels completely different, or you can't solve it the way that you solved it before. That would be really cool, and we have a couple of rooms that, we're planning to do that as well. Just so it's like for the experienced player, sometimes in a room they're just like, I'm always going to take the left path, or always going to take the right path. That there's not really that kind of figuring things out on the fly that would be cool. So I think adding more things that way kind of gives us more content for the amount of time spent.
Right, because it's still that's always a struggle with small teams is making sure that every hour, 2 hours you put into making content, it's going to deliver more bang. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Actually, and speaking of team size, you mentioned you were working pretty alone for the earliest parts, and then slowly the team grew. At, and building a single player experience, which is a very like I'm the only one playing it, and this is the way it's going. Versus now, you've got a full team, you've got a multiplayer experience, which has a lot of people. How do you? What are the pros and cons of having gone from such an for lack of a better term, isolated experience making this game to now it's a very open and like there's tons of people playing it simultaneously, and when you're playtesting it, it's with other people. How do you like and what do you like and dislike about working alone versus working with so many and playing with so many?
Yeah, I think working alone, I think, the best thing is probably you could change anything or throw anything away. Like you're not really, hurting anyone's feelings, or you don't need to, chat with someone, have a discussion to, move a pillar or add an object somewhere. Um, but I think uh, on the same side, because you have so much power to do those things, sometimes you also get lost, right? You can get lost iterating on one thing for too long. You can, because it's so easy for you to change. You don't have to, go through anyone or get anyone's thoughts on it. You just change it. So you could, potentially make a room one day, think it's great. The other next day, you think it's horrible, and then you cut it. So I feel like it's just with the team, it feels a little bit more stable, and with other people playtesting it and stuff, it feels the process itself feels a little bit more stable. Um, Even if it doesn't necessarily uh move as fast on a per capita basis, right? I feel like single player, you could potentially move super, super fast, um, but you do have those issues where, you know, you don't essentially have enough momentum to move over certain points, if that makes sense.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
You get stuck learning something that you don't know versus when you have a team, somebody else already knows this and you can just kind of like
Yeah,
blaze past it. Right.
exactly. Or the thing you're working on is not super interesting, but somebody else makes something cool, and then you get excited.
Right.
So I think there's a factor of momentum that really helps.
I mean, if we're talking about momentum in game dev, do you really feel
Yeah.
like excitement is a key element to a successful project?
Um, I think I don't really know because I've only done it one way, so to speak, right? But I feel like excitement towards the concept, or, whatever your initial thought was, or whatever that got you excited, if you can capture that, I think that really helps.
Mm-hmm.
If you can capture that, if you can nail that down, or, if you can find that if, you aren't too excited at the moment, I think that really helps as well, just because um, obviously sometimes when I'm in development, I feel like this is really bad, but then I remember that at the beginning, when I thought of the concept, it was really interesting. And so that I can like always refer back to that to help, drive things along.
Right. What level is your excitement about the game these days? Like now that you're not just shipped a year ago, but also shipped the multiplayer. How much excitement is there in the process for you?
Yeah, I think it's maybe like, I don't know, like a 60% or something. I think, yeah,
That's
well,
better than we could really expect for
yeah.
8 years.
Definitely, yeah. I think what's exciting about it is when I think about, the things that we could have done better, or the puzzles that we could have done, but we didn't actually end up doing. Some of those things are kind of exciting. Um, yeah.
Um, what that's if looking back at the things that you could have done better gets you excited, is that kind of where you want to steer yourself into it's I'm always torn when you land on something really great like you've done, right?
Right.
There's part of me that wants to like stay in that thing for as long as possible, and then another part of me that's like, I want to go do that exactly, I get to have that exact right again with something else. um,
Right.
how do you balance that desire for newness all the time versus actually taking that excitement for things you could have done and building off of that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a dilemma. I think immediately after shipping, I was definitely like, I want to work on something else.
Mm-hmm.
And but right now, sometimes I'm like, this is kind of cool. We could expand on it. I think for us, for my personal kind of process, I think in order to make a sequel or something, that's there's like a series of check boxes it needs to fulfill, right? One is, do we have enough puzzles? Do we have enough of an interesting, story and world we can tell? Um, and also the third one is, will people find it interesting, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
uh, even if I find it interesting, if most people, you know, are satisfied with the first game and they don't need anything more, then they might not want to, buy the second game, right? And that's why I think doing sequels is so much harder in terms of indie games when it comes, because a lot of times for indie games, it's about providing something new and providing something that gives it novelty, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you make a sequel and you don't have enough things that are different, I feel, then you can come to the problem of like, oh, the people who were excited about the first game because it was new aren't as excited about the second game.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, speaking from experience, it's not just it's double edged, because on one side, if you make it too different from the original,
Right.
people hate that, and if you make it
That's true.
too much alike the original, then people don't care. So
Exactly.
it's a really dangerous balancing act, especially for indies that don't. I mean, there's definitely types of games that can do it, but
Right.
I do agree with the difficulty in doing just a straight up sequel. It's 50 more rooms. Well, I want a different part of my brain tickled. Kind of is the thing. Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting though, because I don't think, like, did you have any of that consideration when you first started 8 years ago? Like, this is a thing that only happens in the mind after you've shipped a successful game, where you really worry about how much people are going to perceive it, right? Because when you started,
Mhm.
I'm going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume you didn't really care too much about whether people were going to think this was a brilliant game or not.
Um, not really. I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
Well, so when you started with the mechanic,
Mm.
um, were you thinking of the game, of this as a game that people were going to like love, and what trying to satisfy them versus trying to just get the mechanic right and get this idea out?
Oh, I see. I th I think in some sense I was trying to do a little bit of both, right? Um, and I think it's because the game was exposed to the public like quite early on.
Okay.
And probably after, you know, there was that first week of work, and then after that there was maybe another like 5 or 6 weeks or something, and then after that, then it was very early on, kind of, exposed to the public in the way that like, we had a YouTube thing going on, and then that got a bunch of views. We had a demo that was uh, that I actually just put on my website as like a portfolio piece, but then a bunch of people started playing it, and so then we eventually took it off, and then later a bunch of people were saying, "Hey, where did that demo go?" So because there was so much attention, I think we couldn't not think of it that way from like from an external perspective, even though arguably maybe it wasn't the healthiest thing to do, right?
So how did you manage then having exposure? Like, how did the exposure affect you creatively? Like, I found as soon as we got exposure, it definitely started to affect us creatively. It added a little bit of pressure that I I probably wasn't really ready for at the time.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you handled it.
Yeah, I think it gave us similar issues, right? It was just too much pressure all of a sudden, and then we were kind of stressed to uh wrap up or finish the game to make as much progress. So during that time, I was still a student, and then we had a student team working on it. And what's hard about it is when you're student team, you don't know essentially anything that, you know, how the process is supposed to go, what the different steps are in order to make a game that kind of achieves all you wanted to achieve.
Hmm.
Then you kind of just start rushing things a little bit, right? And so I think part of why the process took so long is we at some points we would rush things out. We would build something that was interesting, but we didn't, fully want to commit to, and then we had to come back and say, "Oh no, what do we do with this?" Because we got to the next step, but we couldn't take it from that step to a fully shipped game.
Right. It's interesting because you don't hear like there are definitely examples of like good student games that have like become great projects, but it is
Right.
really rare. And this is on my mind mostly because yesterday I had to review a bunch of student games for.
Oh, okay.
So it's fascinating seeing um, the difference in approach in student games, and I'm curious, having done a successful student games, for any
Mhm.
students in the audience that are doing it in a games course, what is the what first off, was this a successful as a student project? Did you get like good grades on it? Like was this a win
Oh,
as a student project?
it was. I think we got like. Well, it's complicated, right? Because it was a student project at different stages,
Hmm.
but when we were working on it as a team, I think we got like a B or something. And I think it's just because I think the pressure and excitement was so high, but we couldn't completely deliver on it in, 4 months or however long the semester was, right?
Hmm.
Which, when you think about it, in development time is insane to make anything, you
Yeah.
know. And from that, if you have a new team, if you're starting an idea and you're making stuff, you're iterating, that's a really really short amount of time to really make anything.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's so we get a B on the assignment, and
Right.
the but what so that's fascinating then, because so it's I mean, yes, it's a successful student project, but not a remarkably successful student project. It's a B, right?
Right.
um so there's a difference then between making a good student project and then making a good project as a student, um because
Yes.
right, you
Yeah.
didn't confine yourself to the course curriculum because you were in an AI program.
Yeah, that was the first time I worked on it, and then I stopped working on it for a while. Yeah.
Right. So didn't obey the curriculum, and then also didn't confine yourself within the time limits of the curriculum as well. And then I guess you did a good enough job, but not it's not A plus
Right.
material. That's
Yeah.
kind of fascinating. So you like, it's nice that the school provides you with the limitation and the necessity to make something, but I think a lot of the success from it comes from disregarding what the school is asking you to do at the same time.
Yeah, I mean that is kind of true, I guess. Yeah. I mean, especially in games where, just throughout college I was just trying to sneak games in whenever I could, when
Right.
there's a programming class or something that had slightly of an open, project description, then I would just try to sneak a game in here and there, yeah.
That resonates with me quite a lot, because like
Mm.
I going through my education experience, very poor education experience. Um, I wanted to make games, but like it sounds like if you're trying to sneak games in, you're not like going to make games. Like, was that always your intention that you wanted to make video games, or were you in courses for other reasons?
Yeah, so I think once I transferred to computer science, my kind of hidden goal was to make games.
Hmm.
Because I started by taking one class where um, it was just like some kind of like programming with graphics or something. It was like a really easy class that non-programmers took. But then I had so much fun with it that I just, made games the whole time. And so I was just kind of had this hidden agenda of I'll transfer to computer science, you know, potentially tell my parents, hey, this our school has really good computer science department.
Right.
I'll transfer it, but secretly try to skew myself towards making games, I guess.
Right. That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
the do something real, please.
Right.
Well, there you go. It's a interesting journey because like I'm very torn on education in games, its
Yeah.
validity,
Right.
whether it's necessary. I've learned so much more outside of trying to learn than I've ever learned trying to learn.
Yeah.
That I kind of naysay it a lot, but there is something really powerful about like having that gun to your head. Please make a game for this course, or do something as a project, and that you've got to get a grade. Um, okay, would you agree then that the difference between getting value out of the assignment is whether or not you're building this project to fulfill the assignment or building the project in a way that also fulfills the assignment?
Um, I kind of think it's the second one. So basically, the way I was thinking about it was I didn't really care about, the grades that much, but I wanted to make something that, was good for me that I could use for future things or I could learn something from. So, in that sense, which I think is a better ruler than whether I'm going to get an A in this class, is whether the things I'm doing here is useful for later on. Uh, that's kind of how I took my classes in a way.
No, I think that's
Yeah.
a very wise approach. A lot of people I think get really bogged down with trying to get the best grade they possibly can versus
Yeah.
let me actually learn and apply that learning in a way that I think is going to be useful. Um,
Yeah. I think sorry,
no, no,
I
go on.
think one thing that benefited me is I never cared that much in the first place about grades, and so I didn't have, a perfect grade to, keep
Maintain.
up. Maintain. I was just like, okay, yeah, I can get a B. I don't care too much.
Right, right. Well, I mean, the game's out and it's overwhelmingly positive reviews and tons of success, which is really, really. I mean, that'll show that B. Um, I want to switch trains just a little bit here. I'm a big fan of games like Superliminal that break perspective, break traditional thinking. Um, anything, so I'm curious, what sort of stuff were you into as you were coming up with the concept for the perspective mechanic, media
Y-
wise? What were you watching, reading? um
Yeah, I think around that time, I played a bunch of games. Portal, of course, was one of it. Antichamber was another one.
Very good.
Um, yeah, very very good stuff. I think, and even besides that, I was just watching. There were different videos of people presenting those games, right? Like, Sense of Wonder Night at the Tokyo Game Show. You had an experimental gameplay workshop. You had these things where people were showing games and presenting them in a certain way that was really interesting and inspired me a lot.
Right. So, what did you find interesting about? I assume you had you had gameplay experience prior to coming into the what I don't know what we'll call non-Euclidean games. The
Yeah.
and what was it about this genre that really got you into it?
Yeah. What really got me into it is kind of that feeling of seeing something you've never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like in it kind of just opens your mind to in video games there's so many different things you could do that, really hasn't been done. So you could always, probably figure out something new that well, video games not that old of an industry, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
at best it's I don't know, like
I think we're still
30,
under.
40 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like super young. So there's just so much room to explore, and I think just I was kind of excited about that. Oh, I could make something that, nobody has seen potentially and and go from there. Yeah.
It's almost, to me, it's like, I watched some videos about the evolution of math, right?
Right.
When it goes from just here, we've got our mechanics for weighing things and assigning values, to eventually starting with algebra and then theoretical numbers, and then going beyond the finites of geometry, really breaks the brain in a way, and it evolves the medium of mathematics in a really profound method. And I think that we're kind of at that stage with games, but it's always really great to see a success like Superliminal, because I think this is like the really important stuff in games, like, because you can't represent these elements in reality or in a movie or anything. This is the stuff that games can do.
Mm,
But it's not always like guaranteed to be a success. You can push
right.
too far. Um, is this the space that you want to stay in for the remainder of your career as a designer? Do you want to continue pushing the envelope, or do you also have a craving to make something a little more traditional, a little more familiar?
Yeah, I think it's complicated because there's pushing the envelopes in different ways, right? Like, so for example, in Superliminal, we kind of pushed on a mechanical level something that was a bit more on the mind bending side, but it's hard to say whether other games can expand on that, or other games can use that and create new things, as opposed to if you expand on, I don't know, like the way PUBG made battle royale games popular or
Mm-hmm.
something, then that's something that tons of games could use, that you can apply to a bunch of different things. So I feel like uh, both types are interesting, and we don't necessarily need to stay in kind of just like very mind bending mechanic space.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned that PUBG is an example of pushing things. There's a lot of instances where a game comes along and it presents a new idea, and the idea is fantastic, and the entire industry absorbs it,
Right.
but the
Right.
game and the game creators themselves don't necessarily see all the benefit of that.
Right.
It's like Carmack and Romero make first person shooter. There's a million first person shooters now, but they don't. I mean, apart from some cultural cachet, they don't get that. PUBG, here's battle royale. Okay, Fortnite is now the biggest battle royale game, right?
Yeah. The PUBG guy is still probably
He's doing fine.
horrendously rich, but yeah, yeah, yeah. But a lot of the times, it's not kind of the first movers that get the most advantage, right? Sometimes it's the first polished product that comes along, or the first thing that catches everybody's attention.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, acknowledging that we're standing on shoulders of other first person puzzle games here, but how does it feel to be sort of in that realm of a first mover when it comes to like a perspective adjusting, like this is a new mechanic that you invented?
I think it feels all right, I guess, because it's yeah, to us, it's like it's so specific
Mm-hmm.
that it's hard to kind of expand on it in a way. We've seen the other people do it in a completely different way, but still playing with perspective. But it's hard to take the exact same things and then move it to kind of a larger scale. So I feel like uh you know culturally or structurally or design wise, it's not going to have as big as an impact as, let's say, like Portal or Antichamber, in a sense, right? Because those games kind of, you could argue that Portal kind of started a wave of first person puzzle games. You could say that Antichamber started more mind bending stuff in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, so I don't know if we have that kind of uh, cultural impact, but it's definitely nice to know that it's something that when people talk about perspective stuff, that some on Reddit, someone will probably say, "Hey, you should check out this game called Superliminal."
Right.
So
Right. To
that's
be
what we got, and that's pretty cool. Yeah.
right, to be in the grander conversation is I mean, that's the one of the highest honors I think you can get as a game designer, is that your game is a touchstone when talking about certain concepts. So I think you've done a great job there. Do you think there's a growing appetite for these kind of games, or is it going to always be this niche of people who've played way too many games and really want something new and also happen to think too much?
Yeah, I feel like players are getting kind of smarter all the time, so I feel like eventually there'll be more players in this genre. I mean, when you look at like Portal, which so many people has played, you kind of can probably think that the audience is really big, right? And I think
Hmm.
that is true. It's just whether, games can capture that exact itch of mind bendingness and humor and story and all these kind of things. It's just a very difficult task to do.
Right. Is
Yeah.
there, if you had to like boil it down and summarize in one mantra, the methodology of keeping that balance perfect, like you've done, what would you say it is?
That is really hard.
Well, yes. Fair.
Yeah, because I think it's so dependent on kind of personal taste in a way.
Hmm.
But I feel like there's so many different ways to think about it. But the way I think about it is if I have something I like and I know that other people like that thing, then I can in a way project my feelings towards, for them, right? In a
Right.
way. And that of course doesn't always work, right? If you're designing, I don't know, a game for a demographic you're not in, right? Then that's going to be very difficult to do, right? You probably have to do a lot of research. And so I think that, especially for people starting out, maybe doing something closer to your heart really helps you kind of increase the chances of making something that people really like.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's like the old writer's adage, right? Write what you know, or and I guess if it's games,
Right.
then make what you like to play,
Right.
rather than trying to be something you're not. It's totally, I mean, it's a tried and true advice.
Yeah.
Uh,
I feel like it's a little bit controversial just because in terms of design, people like designing all sorts of different things. So sometimes, not necessarily what they know, but they can get there, if they do enough research.
right. I do also think that this is like unique to the indie space,
Yeah.
because if you're working in AAA, well, then
Right.
you're making what the boss tells you, and whether you like it,
Exactly.
well, whether you like it or not, but
Right.
that's just the way it goes.
Yeah.
Uh, so as we come to near to the end here, is there anything you want people to like take a look at? Obviously, guys, go play Superliminal, play the multiplayer update. It's a lot of fun. But is there anything you'd like to direct people's attention to elsewise? And where should they
No.
pay attention to Superliminal updates?
Yeah, so for Superliminal updates, follow our Twitter, our Facebook, um, and we'll slowly kind of push the multiplayer version to different platforms and add more things. We have a patch plan, so that could be pretty cool. Yeah, and I guess just enjoy the game. If you have Superliminal already, the updates going to be there already, so you can just open up and play. Yeah,
And
and that's pretty much it.
any final pro tips for like absolutely owning every single one of these every round I enter?
Yeah, I think just try to sneakily grief everyone so then they and make sure that they can't grief you back. And that's kind of yeah,
Perfect,
that's what I
perfect.
do.
That's a true
Yeah,
multiplayer experience then.
right.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about Superliminal and the multiplayer and the whole history of it. It's been a lot of fun having you, and yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Justin.
All right, goodbye, everybody. I'll see you. I don't know when, but goodbye.